The last time my brother attended one of our family dinners, he left before the evening ended and never came back. At the time, nobody seemed particularly worried about his absence because everyone assumed he was being distant again. My father dismissed it as another example of Ronan being difficult, while my mother convinced herself that he simply needed some time alone. I accepted those explanations without thinking too deeply about them because they sounded reasonable. Years later, I realized that Ronan had not walked away from our family in a single evening. He had been drifting away for years, and none of us had paid enough attention to notice it. My name is Linnea Hartwell, and for most of my life, I was the person everyone noticed first. Whenever something good happened to me, my parents celebrated it as if it belonged to the entire family. They spoke proudly about my grades, my achievements, and my future plans to anyone willing to listen. Relatives knew my academic history better than they knew many details about their own children. At the time, I believed this was simply what supportive parenting looked like. The moment that forced me to reconsider everything happened during my final year at university. I was sitting in the library when an email arrived, informing me that I had been accepted into a highly competitive research program. After reading the message several times to make sure I had not misunderstood it, I called my mother and shared the news. Her excitement was immediate and overwhelming, and by the time I arrived home later that evening, she had already informed neighbors, relatives, and several family friends. The atmosphere inside our house felt more like a celebration than an ordinary weekday. My father greeted me at the door with a smile so wide that it looked almost unbelievable. Throughout the evening, he repeated the story to every person who happened to visit or call. Listening to him describe my achievement made me feel proud, but it also reminded me of something I had never seriously questioned before. Moments like this were common in our family whenever I succeeded, yet I struggled to remember similar celebrations for my brother. Ronan was 6 years older than me and completely different in almost every way. While I enjoyed studying and spending time in classrooms, he preferred practical work that produced visible results. He could repair machinery, build furniture, and solve technical problems that seemed impossible to everyone else. People outside our family respected those skills because they could see the quality of his work. Unfortunately, my parents measured success through a different lens. Academic achievements impressed them far more than practical talents, and because of that difference, they rarely recognized the value of what Ronan accomplished. The imbalance was never obvious enough to start arguments, which made it easier to ignore. Nobody openly compared us. Nobody announced that one child mattered more than the other. Instead, the difference appeared in smaller ways that accumulated over time. Conversations revolved around my future. Family gatherings focused on my achievements. Relatives remembered my important dates and milestones with remarkable accuracy. Ronan received attention as well, but never with the same energy or enthusiasm. Looking back now, I understand how easily people can overlook unfairness when it develops gradually. Human beings adapt quickly to patterns, especially when those patterns feel familiar. When something happens often enough, it eventually begins to feel normal, even if it would seem strange to an outsider. That lesson became painfully clear once I started examining my family more honestly. One Sunday afternoon, several relatives joined us for lunch. The dining room was filled with the smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, and the conversation moved comfortably between different topics as everyone settled into their seats. As usual, someone asked about my studies within the first few minutes. That single question quickly developed into a long discussion about my research program, my future career, and the opportunities waiting for me after graduation. For a while, I enjoyed the attention because I had experienced it so many times before. Then my aunt shifted the conversation by asking Ronan about a woodworking project he had recently completed for a community center. I remembered seeing photographs of the project online and being impressed by its design. The moment she asked about it, something changed in his expression. He became more animated and engaged than he had been all afternoon, and he began explaining the planning process, the materials he selected, and the challenges he faced during construction. For the first time that day, everyone seemed genuinely interested in hearing about his work. Unfortunately, the moment did not last very long. Before Ronan could finish explaining the project, my father interrupted him and redirected the discussion back toward my research program. The transition happened so naturally that most people barely seemed aware of it. Questions about my future immediately replaced questions about Ronan's work, and within seconds the spotlight returned to me exactly where it had been before. I remember glancing across the table after the conversation shifted. Ronan did not appear angry or offended, which somehow made the moment more uncomfortable. His expression suggested that he had experienced similar situations so many times that disappointment no longer surprised him. Instead of reacting, he simply became quieter and allowed the conversation to continue without him. That image stayed with me long after lunch ended. Many people assume favoritism reveals itself through dramatic actions, but reality is often much more subtle. It can appear through repeated interruptions, forgotten accomplishments, and patterns of attention that slowly shape relationships over many years. The damage rarely arrives all at once because it develops gradually, becoming visible only after enough time has passed. Several weeks later, I found another example while searching through old family photographs stored in our attic. Most of the albums focused heavily on my achievements, including school competitions, graduation ceremonies, academic awards, and special events that my parents considered important. As I turned page after page, I noticed how frequently I appeared at the center of every memory. Eventually, I began looking specifically for photographs of Ronan. To my surprise, there were very few. One photograph showed him standing beside a truck he had restored himself. Another captured him holding a fishing rod during a family trip years earlier. Then I found something that bothered me more than I expected. A small photograph of Ronan had slipped behind a larger frame containing one of my academic awards. Only part of his face remained visible, as though he had accidentally become hidden behind another story. The image stayed in my mind because it felt symbolic of something I was only beginning to understand. Later that evening, another memory returned unexpectedly. When I turned 16, my parents organized a large birthday celebration that included decorations, dozens of guests, professional photographs, and enough attention to make me feel like the most important person in the world. While thinking about that event, I suddenly remembered that Ronan's 22nd birthday had occurred only 2 weeks earlier. His celebration consisted of pizza in the kitchen, a rushed apology from my mother for forgetting to order a cake, and an evening that nobody bothered to photograph. Sitting alone with those memories forced me to confront a possibility I had avoided for years. I had always assumed that my brother and I were treated differently because our interests were different. For the first time, I began wondering whether the explanation was much simpler and far more painful. Maybe my parents had chosen a favorite long ago, and maybe Ronan had spent years paying the price for a decision he never made. Before I share the rest of story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. The more I reflected on those memories, the more difficult it became to ignore what had been happening inside our family. For years, I had accepted every celebration, every compliment, and every opportunity without questioning why so much attention seemed to flow in one direction. Once I began noticing the pattern, examples appeared everywhere. Small moments that once felt ordinary suddenly carried a completely different meaning. A month later, my parents organized another gathering at our house. They wanted to celebrate the research program and introduce me to several family friends who worked in related fields. The event was supposed to help me build professional connections, and everyone treated it as an important step toward my future. By late afternoon, cars lined the street, conversations filled the house, and my parents moved through the rooms with visible excitement. As guests arrived, I paid closer attention than I ever had before. People congratulated me before they had even removed their coats. My father repeated the story of my acceptance letter so many times that I could almost recite it from memory. Every new arrival received the same explanation, the same details, and the same proud smile. Meanwhile, Ronan spent most of the evening helping wherever he was needed. He carried tables from the garage, fixed a loose gate in the backyard, and helped my mother arrange decorations that had fallen earlier in the day. Everyone appreciated his help, yet very few people seemed interested in anything beyond the tasks he completed. Once the problem disappeared, the attention disappeared with it. Watching him that evening made me uncomfortable in a way I could not fully explain. For years, I had enjoyed being the person everyone noticed. Now I found myself wondering how many times Ronan had stood in similar rooms feeling invisible while everyone celebrated someone else. As dinner approached, I noticed another example that stayed with me long after the evening ended. A family friend asked my father whether Ronan's furniture business was still operating. The question sounded harmless, but my father answered it quickly before turning the conversation back toward my studies. He spent less than 20 seconds discussing a business that had supported my brother for years, then spent the next several minutes explaining my future plans in remarkable detail. The difference was impossible to ignore. Success often depends on recognition as much as achievement. People naturally invest energy in areas they believe matter, and attention becomes a powerful form of encouragement. When one person's accomplishments are constantly celebrated, while another person's efforts receive only brief acknowledgement, both individuals eventually begin to see themselves through that unequal lens. Later that evening, my father gathered everyone into the living room and announced that he wanted to say a few words. Family members settled into chairs, while others stood along the walls holding drinks and small plates of food. My father remained near the fireplace and spoke with the confidence of someone delivering important news. He praised my academic achievements, described my future potential, and explained how proud he felt whenever people asked about me. Most of what he said sounded familiar because I had heard similar speeches before. Then he made a comment that changed the atmosphere of the room for me. He explained that every family eventually produces one person who carries the hopes of future generations. According to him, I was that person. Several guests nodded in agreement. Others applauded politely. I looked across the room toward Ronan. He lowered his eyes and stared at the floor. Nobody else seemed bothered by the statement, but I could not stop thinking about it. The comment suggested that one person's future mattered more than everyone else's. Even if my father never intended it that way, the message felt painfully clear. During the following weeks, I became increasingly aware of how deeply the pattern had shaped our family. Old photographs told the same story. Family conversations followed the same structure. Even our group messages reflected the imbalance. Whenever I shared good news, responses arrived immediately. Relatives filled the conversation with congratulations and encouragement. When Ronan posted photographs of completed projects, the reaction was often limited to a few brief comments before the discussion moved elsewhere. The realization became even more uncomfortable after a visit with my grandmother. She had always been one of the few people willing to discuss difficult truths honestly. One rainy afternoon, while we sat together near her kitchen window, I asked whether parents could accidentally favor one child without realizing it. She considered the question carefully before answering. According to her, favoritism rarely begins with bad intentions. Parents often notice a particular strength in one child and focus extra attention on helping that strength grow. Over time, that attention becomes a habit. Eventually, one child learns to expect encouragement, while the other learns to expect very little. Her words stayed with me for days. The following weekend, I visited Ronan's workshop again. The business looked busier than ever, with employees moving between projects and customers discussing future orders. Everything suggested success. Yet when I finally sat down with my brother, our conversation uncovered something I had never known. As we shared childhood memories, Ronan mentioned a scholarship competition I had won during high school. I smiled immediately because I remembered it clearly. Winning that competition had opened several important opportunities for me, and my parents had celebrated it for months afterward. Then Ronan revealed something that left me speechless. Years earlier, he had been offered a prestigious apprenticeship in another state. The opportunity would have allowed him to work with experienced craftsmen and develop skills that could transform his future career. Instead of accepting it, he stayed home because our family could not afford both his apprenticeship expenses and the travel costs connected to my competition season. Nobody had ever told me. According to Ronan, the decision had been presented as a family necessity. As I sat there listening, a painful realization settled over me. The opportunities I remembered as personal achievements had not belonged entirely to me. Someone else had quietly given up part of his future to make them possible. And for the first time, I began to understand how much my brother had lost while everyone else was busy celebrating me. I drove home from the workshop in complete silence. The road was familiar, but my thoughts felt completely different from anything I had experienced before. For years, I had viewed my achievements as individual accomplishments that resulted from hard work and determination. While those things were certainly true, I now understood that another part of the story had remained hidden from me. Ronan had sacrificed an opportunity that could have changed the direction of his life, and nobody had considered that information important enough to share with me. The realization stayed with me for several days. I replayed old memories repeatedly, searching for signs I had missed. Once I started looking more carefully, I discovered examples everywhere. Moments that once seemed ordinary now appeared connected by the same pattern. My parents had invested enormous energy into building my future, but they had often done so at the expense of noticing my brother's needs. The most painful part was that nobody seemed to recognize the damage while it was happening. Eventually, I decided that avoiding the issue would only make things worse. A week later, I invited my parents to dinner at a small restaurant near the river. The location was quiet enough for a serious conversation, and I hoped the neutral setting would help everyone remain calm. My mother seemed curious about the invitation, while my father appeared slightly concerned from the moment he arrived. For the first part of the evening, we discussed ordinary topics. We talked about work, family updates, and future plans. The conversation remained comfortable until I placed an old photograph on the table. The picture showed Ronan standing beside the woodworking project that had won first place at a state exhibition years earlier. My parents immediately recognized it. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. I asked a simple question. I wanted to know why nobody had celebrated that achievement the way they celebrated mine. My father leaned back in his chair and stared at the photograph for a long time before answering. He admitted that he remembered the exhibition, but he had never considered it as important as my academic competitions. My mother quietly explained that they believed Ronan was independent and capable of succeeding without additional encouragement. Their answers were honest. They were also deeply disappointing. Neither explanation changed the reality of what had happened. Ronan had spent years watching his accomplishments receive less attention, less excitement, and less support than mine. The imbalance may not have been intentional, but it was impossible to deny. Many people believe good intentions automatically protect relationships from harm. In reality, intentions matter far less than consistent actions. A person can care deeply about someone and still cause damage if they fail to notice what that person needs. Awareness is often more important than affection because people cannot solve problems they refuse to see. For the first time in my life, my parents listened without interrupting. I told them about the forgotten birthday. I told them about the interrupted conversations and the family gatherings where Ronan's achievements disappeared within minutes. Then I shared what he had revealed about the apprenticeship he gave up years earlier. The reaction was immediate. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father lowered his head and remained silent for so long that I began to wonder whether he would respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different from anything I had heard before. The confidence that usually defined him had disappeared, replaced by something closer to regret. The conversation lasted for hours. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The truth was painful enough without adding anger to it. A few days later, my parents visited Ronan's workshop. They spent the afternoon walking through the building, meeting employees, and learning about projects they should have understood years earlier. For the first time, they asked detailed questions about his work and listened carefully to the answers. From the outside, it looked like the beginning of a happy ending. The reality was more complicated. Ronan welcomed them politely and treated them with respect, but something important had changed. The easy warmth that should have existed between parents and their son no longer came naturally. Years of feeling overlooked had created a distance that could not disappear in a single afternoon. As we left the workshop, my mother cried quietly during the drive home. I think that was the moment she finally understood the true cost of favoritism. The damage had never been one dramatic event. It had been hundreds of small moments repeated over many years. It had been forgotten birthdays, interrupted conversations, overlooked achievements, and opportunities that quietly disappeared without recognition. Months passed, and our family slowly began changing. My parents made a genuine effort to support both of us equally. Family gatherings became more balanced, and conversations no longer revolved entirely around my future. Those changes mattered, but they did not erase the past. Trust rebuilds slowly because trust depends on experience rather than promises. People need time to believe that lasting change is real, especially when old patterns have existed for many years. Today, my relationship with Ronan is stronger than it once was. We speak regularly, and I have learned to appreciate qualities that I spent too many years overlooking. My parents continue trying to repair what was damaged, and I respect the effort they have made. However, I also understand something that took me a long time to learn. Favoritism hurts everyone involved. The overlooked child learns to expect less than they deserve. The favored child learns to accept attention without questioning its source. Parents lose opportunities to truly know the children standing right in front of them. My family eventually recognized those mistakes, but recognition arrived later than it should have. When I think about Ronan now, I no longer see the quiet brother sitting at the edge of family gatherings. I see a talented man who built a successful life despite years of being underestimated. More importantly, I see someone who deserved to be recognized long before anyone finally decided to look. My name is Linnea Hartwell, and for most of my life I believed being the favorite child was a gift. It took me years to understand that real love is not measured by how much attention one person receives. Real love makes room for everyone, and families begin to break the moment they forget that simple truth. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.